Welcome, everyone. It is great to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this SWAT talk about the Republican Party and the authoritarian threat, featuring Will Saletan, class of '87. My name is Jason Zengerle. I am from the class of 1996, and I will be the moderator tonight. Before we hear from Will, I just wanted to go over a few preliminary pieces of business. SWAT Talks is a speaker series brought to you by the Swarthmore Alumni Council, of which I'm a member. Tonight's session will be recorded, so you will be able to find it online at the SWAT Talks page on the Swarthmore College website within 2 or 3 weeks. If you're interested in watching previous talks, you can also find those on the SWAT Talks page. For those of you who are new to SWAT Talks, or for our regulars who just need a reminder, tonight will go something like this. Will is going to hold the floor for the first half hour or so, answering some of my questions, and then he'll spend the second half hour answering any questions you might have. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom, and please be sure to include your name and class year when you do so. I will collect those questions and will pose as many of them as I can to Will during the second half of the SWAT talk. So I'd like to introduce Will Saletan. In these polarized times, there's very little liberals and conservatives see eye to eye on, but one thing they do agree about is that Will is one of the smartest political commentators and analysts working in journalism today. The Washington Post columnist E.J. Dionne has called Will, quote, a great political journalist with a strong moral sense. Rich Lowry, the former editor of National Review, has described Will as, quote, one of America's shrewdest political writers. At Swarthmore, Will was a philosophy major with a minor in sociology, anthropology, and political science. As I said earlier, he graduated in 1987. For much of Will's journalism career, he worked at Slate magazine, where he was the chief political correspondent. I saw this stat the other day. In his more than 25 years at Slate, he wrote more than 2,700 stories. Last year, Will went to work at The Bulwark. It's a website that was founded in 2018 as a home for center-right writers and thinkers who couldn't quite stomach Donald Trump. You can now not only read Will's writing there, but you can also listen to him every Monday when he appears on the Bulwark podcast. Will is the author of 2 books. The first, which was published in 2004, is Bearing Right: How Conservatives Won the Abortion War. The second, which was published last month as an ebook, is The Corruption of Lindsey Graham, a case study in the rise of authoritarianism. And it's this second book that he's here to discuss with us tonight. Will, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
I thought I'd start with a pretty broad question, especially for people who are watching who might not have yet had a chance to read your book. And that is, what is the corruption of Lindsey Graham? What is the argument you're trying to make about him?
What I'm trying to explain is the slow process of how Republicans rationalized an authoritarian candidate and then president. Basically, how did authoritarianism arise in this country? And what I try to describe, when I first approached my editor at the Bulwark about this, I said, I want to watch the frog boil. I want to describe the gradual process, because there's an illusion on the part of a lot of people that this is something that happens suddenly, that there's some sudden moment at which somebody sells out. And that happens sometimes, but in this case, that's not what happened. And it's really important that we understand every stage of it. There's the stages of it, roughly speaking, are: first, there's a process of rationalization where the Republicans in Congress start to come up with reasons why it's okay to support this candidate, Donald Trump, this nominee, and then this president, Donald Trump, as he begins to commit authoritarian acts. And then there's sort of a shift of power where they become afraid of him, essentially. Their initial cowardice in rationalizing it becomes cowardice in further acceding to the changes that he makes in policy and in the way we govern ourselves. And then finally, there's a process of polarization in which they convince themselves that they essentially descend into a kind of paranoia where the other party is so awful and dangerous, they tell themselves, that they, the Republicans, must support the president no matter what he does. So it's that roughly 3-stage process, which is continuing to this day, obviously, even when we get to the point of an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States on January 6th, they stay with him, even when he says, as he did last December, that the Constitution should literally be suspended to reinstate him. They continue to support him. And so that's the general process that I'm trying to describe. There's at the beginning of the article or book, however you want to describe it, the way I put it was, it's poison. It's a process of poisoning. And what happens mentally is, the deeper you go, the more you need to justify. You say what you need to say, you believe what you need to believe. So it's a psychological process that culminates in a great danger to our country and the world.
Did you have any hesitation about using the term authoritarian in this? I mean, and sort of tackling this topic, because, you know, right off the bat, you're you're staking out a fairly you know, bold claim there.
Yeah, it's the term that fits. There are other terms that I thought were going a little far to start with. I didn't use the term dictator, I don't think at all. Autocratic is another term, but autocracy we generally think of as something like Kim Jong-un, not what happened in the United States. But authoritarianism is something that we see happening in Europe. It's happened in this country in the past, but the consolidation of power behind a single man, and the increasing attribution of authority to that person, to the exclusion of other constraining institutions. That is authoritarianism, and that is what has been gradually happening in this country.
You know, the subtitle of the book is a case study in authoritarianism. Why did you decide to make Lindsey Graham the case study for this?
For a few reasons. I mean, he was at the center of the action. Graham was one of the originally Trump's chief critic in 2015 and 2016. And he wanted to be in the center of policymaking. So he very quickly began to roll over to Trump, and he was constantly making trips to the White House, constantly talking. He was on the phone with Trump all the time. So he worked himself into the middle of things. So that's one reason. The other reasons were, sorry, I'm just going to take a look at a couple of notes here. There's a stark shift in Graham over time that's different from anybody else. He starts out, people forget this, unlike a lot of other Republicans, he starts out as saying all the things you or I would say. Anyone who's here with us today would have said at the beginning, Donald Trump is a dangerous man. Donald Trump wants to ban an entire religion from this country. Donald Trump is talking about committing war crimes. Lindsey Graham said all of those things. And so over time, he went from being like us to being such a devout apologist for Donald Trump that when other politicians on the right bailed out on Trump and said they wouldn't support it, Graham became, he decided to stand with Trump no matter what. And the other thing was, and this is the thing that really made it possible, Jason, Lindsey Graham would not shut up. I mean, the guy just talked constantly. So there are other politicians who, like Marco Rubio, for example, Paul Ryan, Ted Cruz, you can find others who made some of the same transition, but you can't document it the way you can with Lindsey Graham, because there wasn't any TV interview, any radio interview that he was offered that he didn't take that opportunity. And so it's possible in his case to get this pixelated, high resolution view of this gradual process, because you can see him literally day to day, week to week, in a way that you can't do with anybody else.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I thought was so interesting about the book, was that it was all based on stuff Graham himself said publicly. I mean, there are different kinds of reporting. There are some people, and I think if you're doing like a Marco Rubio book, you would have tried to talk to people around Rubio and find the things he was saying in private and behind the scenes and sort of rationalizing his own kind of capitulation. Like you said, Graham was saying it all publicly. Why? I guess my question about that is, like, why do you think we should trust what Lindsey Graham is saying publicly? I mean, there's this idea that politicians, they say one thing to the cameras, they say another thing sort of off camera. Is Graham, in your eyes, unique in that respect? Or do you think sometimes journalists discount too much what politicians are saying publicly, and actually there's plenty of truth in what they say publicly, and you don't necessarily need to get the killer behind the scenes anecdote?
Right. It's a good question. And let me just say, there are topics that you can write about and stories you can write about where you absolutely need to get underneath it. You're getting a story, and then you need to penetrate that story and find out what's going on behind the scenes. In this case, what I was writing about was a process of rationalization, and rationalization takes place in public. So what I'm tracing is the evolution of public arguments given by a guy who's trying to justify supporting Donald Trump and becoming closer to Donald Trump and defending what Donald Trump does. So the truth of what he believes, and by the way, you can get at the truth. The truth of it comes out because, and here's the argument I would make to you about Lindsey Graham. Other people were able to keep their mouths shut, like Mitch McConnell. What did he really think? What does he really think? Often difficult to know. But when you talk as much publicly as Graham has done, sooner or later, the truth comes out. Sooner or later, what you think comes out. There's an example that I have in the story where one of the things I did was listen to all of his radio interviews. And there's one with Sean Hannity at the beginning of January 2019, where he says, he's just exasperated in this interview with Hannity. And he says, this constant nagging of the, liberals going after Trump on everything, that the Russia thing and later into the Ukraine thing. It's one damn thing after another. He says, he said, it's just driving me nuts. It's driven me into Trump's camp. Well, you can sort of surmise that that's what's happened, but here he is just blurting it out. And that isn't really a talking point. And it just came out of his mouth because he's having a conversation in public. And there was a lot of that.
When you went back and looked at the stuff he was saying in 2015, that it was interesting in that campaign. So many of the Republican presidential, I think people forget that Lindsey Graham was actually running for president in 2015, but so many of the other Republican presidential candidates were, terrified of crossing Trump, and they were basically hoping, they all thought Trump was going to implode and they were going to inherit his voters, and so they didn't want to do anything, take Trump on directly. Graham was like one of the few who actually did. I think in part because Trump was insulting John McCain at the time, and Graham and John McCain were so tight. Were there ever any moments when you were looking at Graham's kind of subsequent behavior where he acknowledged that? I know he has, you write this really interesting sort of part about how Graham rationalized his flip-flop by saying, Trump beat me. And obviously the American people have spoken, and therefore I need to be on his side. He didn't do that when Barack Obama won. But were there things besides that kind of rationalization he made that you saw where he at least acknowledged that, yeah, like I once thought this guy was horrible. I made all these warnings about him. Did he himself ever try to say, well, my opinion changed because he himself is different than I thought he was? Or did he just never try to reconcile those two things?
He did. He got asked about it a lot because Graham didn't just go on Fox News. He didn't just get the friendly questions. He went on CNN. He took difficult questions from the mainstream press, and they asked him about exactly what you're talking about. And he would talk to some extent about how he did say that his opinion of Trump personally changed. Now, I would say, objectively speaking, Donald Trump is one of the worst people this country has ever produced. He was then, he still is today. If anything, he's worse now. He's become more unhinged. So this can't be true generally. But Graham would say, I've had personal interactions with the president. He would say, I play golf with him. There's a point in the story where he talks about Tuesday Trump and Thursday Trump. And Thursday Trump was the guy who at this meeting to talk about immigration talked about shithole countries. He's just this racist description of, Haiti and these other countries where Trump says we don't want immigrants from them. And then there's this other meeting that was happened 2 days earlier, also about immigration, where Trump was supposedly very nice. And that one's on camera and on C-SPAN. Now, of course, the reason why Trump is nice is because the cameras are there, right? We find the real Trump in the Thursday meeting. But Graham talks about, I played golf with the president, and he's so charming on the golf course. And the golf thing is such a great way of understanding this mistake on Graham's part, because Trump was being nice to Graham because the only people that Trump played golf with were friends and sycophants, right? He's like, you're not experiencing what the man is like dealing with the presidency and a political system where you have to make compromises. In other words, you don't experience the authoritarian tendencies of the man. So there was this illusion Graham had about his personal relationship with Trump being nice. But the other thing Graham said was that he would say, yeah, I said that stuff about Trump in 2015 and 2016, but then Trump won. Now, you and I would say, and so how does that change the nature of Trump? It doesn't. But Graham wanted to rationalize why it didn't matter what he had said before. So he said that because the voters elected Trump, their verdict on Trump, they overrode Graham's judgment. And Graham would say, I wouldn't have even said that stuff if I'd known he was going to win, if he was going to win. So one of my editors called this democracy washing. It's a really interesting problem because we think of democracy as self-protecting. But in this case, democracy provided the rationale, the rationalization for why Graham should accept an authoritarian president on the basis of the argument that the voters chose him.
I mean, I think because Graham talked so much and was so kind of, out there and changing on Trump, there was a lot of sort of psychoanalyzing of him during the Trump years. I mean, some of it was not quite, it wasn't all. I mean, Steve Schmidt, who had been John McCain's campaign manager in 2008, I mean, he said Graham was a pilot fish. He always had to follow around the big fish. And for a time, the big fish was John McCain. I mean, Graham was like John McCain's little buddy back, during the 2008 campaign and even after, and they would travel together abroad. But then, McCain gets sick and he loses sort of his sway in the Republican Party, and Graham finds a new big fish, and that's Donald Trump. And so Graham's this pilot fish. I mean, there were other theories about him that were a lot nastier. I mean, I think there were a lot of liberals, especially online, who speculated that, Graham was a closeted homosexual, and that Trump people were blackmailing him, and that's why he'd come around. I mean, you didn't spend any time on any of those theories in the book, and I was wondering, did you think about addressing those at all, or just to dismiss them, or what are the fact that people were making those sort of arguments about Graham? What does that say about sort of how we view this process from afar? That some people almost, I feel like we're trying to rationalize Graham's behavior in some way.
Yeah, people want, I say people, a lot of people, it's human nature. A lot of people seem to want a simple theory, what they think of as a simple theory for why somebody sold out, right? So the very popular one on the internet is Lindsey Graham is gay and Donald Trump has the goods on it, and that he's holding that over Graham, and that's why Graham does whatever Trump wants. And first of all, I have so many problems with this theory. There isn't very clear evidence that it's true. Even the gay part is not exactly clear. Why it would matter, the idea that Lindsey Graham would need to keep this in the closet if it were true. It's also just not true that there was some sudden moment of change. If you look at the history that I document, it's a gradual process. So it isn't, the whole blackmail theory doesn't fit that. But I think it's sort of cheap and easy to use that theory because it helps us think that that this is a simple thing. It's much scarier what really happened. What really happened is this gradual process, and it sort of brings home that they don't have to have blackmail on you for you to sell out, right? You can just work it out in your own head, even if, as Lindsey Graham was 2 years ago before this, knew everything that was wrong and said everything that was wrong with Trump. The pilot fish thing is interesting, and I think it's true, Jason. I think the idea that Lindsey Graham was sort of a little brother attached to John McCain. McCain dies and Graham has attached himself already to Donald Trump, who's sort of the new alpha in his life. But, I think that's what I wanted to understand was not the aspects of what Graham did that were particular to him. I wanted to understand the general thing. And so to me, the pilot fish thing is a specific version of a general thing that happened in the Republican Party. And the general thing was cowardice. The general thing was a strong-willed authoritarian type comes in, meaning Trump. And people like Graham, whether it was because they were sort of naturally pilot fish or naturally cowardly in some other way, just rolled over for him. And there's a third version of the story, which is there's the gay thing, there's the pilot fish thing, and there's this golf thing, that there was some magic golf outing that Graham went on with Trump in 2017, and something happened then. Maybe it was the blackmail, maybe it was something, but again, doesn't correspond to reality. There was a lot of change that happened after that.
I think one of the really interesting things you write in the book is that at the outset, it was more arrogance than cowardice on Graham's part in some ways. Like, he thought that he could manage Trump, and that, he had foreign policy views that were very different than Trump's. I mean, he was much more of interventionist, a neocon, and he thought, Trump was an idiot, and therefore he could kind of control him. Obviously that did, and it worked for a little while. I mean, Trump did sort of adopt more neocon policies, but at a certain point he changed. I mean, At what point do you think the arrogance turned into cowardice, or do you think that like someone like Lindsey Graham still thinks that he can, pull the strings on Donald Trump and other Republicans as well? I mean, how much of this, how many Republicans are there today who don't like Donald Trump, but and are maybe afraid of getting on the wrong side of his voters, but also think this guy's a buffoon. I can get what I need out of him. I mean, like Leonard Leo got a Supreme Court out of Donald Trump. I mean, it does seem like that's an instance where Trump kind of was outsmarted and outmaneuvered by an establishment conservative Republican. Are there other people out there, maybe besides Leonard Leo, who still thinks this? Does Lindsey Graham still think this, or do you think that at a certain point arrogance just turns into cowardice?
I think what the record certainly shows in Graham's case, and I would argue that it shows generally, is that the arrogance was just a gateway drug. The arrogance was they come in, Trump wins the election, surprises all these guys. They didn't really think he would win. He wins, and now they're going to Trump Tower. And then when he's in the White House, they're going to the White House, and they're all sucking up. They weren't Trumpers to begin with, and they think at that point that he is an idiot. Donald Trump today is an idiot. You can see him talking to Brett Baer for 2 hours or whatever, just giving away the classified documents case by, he's just a complete moron, a dangerous moron, but a moron, right? And so, but they thought that they could sort of outsmart him. And it turns out over time that the sheer will to power of this guy just overwhelms them. And the other thing is, although he's a moron, he's got the Republican Party base behind him. So now they're afraid of the base. They're afraid of that even to this day, right? Donald Trump is even more insane than he ever was, but he's got a 40-point, 50-point lead in the Republican primary. And none of these politicians are afraid to take, with very few exceptions, are very afraid to take him on. So I think we're in a period of fear now, where so many of these folks who know better are just afraid of alienating not just Trump, but the Republican electorate.
Do you think that people like Graham and maybe others have changed their own view of what it means to be a conservative? I mean, in the sense that, Lindsey Graham's priors seem very different than Donald Trump's in terms of what he believes about, domestic policy, foreign policy. But at a certain point, he's obviously fallen in line behind Trump. I mean, do you think he kind of accepts that unless you support Donald Trump, you're not really a true conservative anymore? Or do you think there's still some vestiges of that he's holding on to, and were Trump to go away, he would go back to the way he operated before? I mean, how much of this is going to be a long-lasting shift? How many of these changes that have occurred in guys like Graham, like how much of them are dependent on Trump, or will they at some point, and if Trump goes away, do they go back to the way they were before? Is Trump's influence on the Republican Party, even once he's gone, going to still loom over these guys?
Well, it's a great question, and we won't know the answer for some time. It's being sort of experimentally tested right now. Let me take Mike Pence, actually, to sort of address your question, because Mike Pence, literally Trump's former vice president, is running against him for the Republican nomination. And part of the case that Pence is making is that Trump isn't really conservative in the ways that you just described. And I think that I'm trying to remember the issues. Pence says Trump is not sufficiently pro-life, that he's not hardcore enough on abortion. He says that he is not really for reforming entitlements, which Trump is not. Trump's got sort of a democratic position of let's protect Social Security and Medicare. And Ukraine. Ukraine's the big thing. Yeah. And we, believing in a traditional muscular conservative foreign policy, whereas Trump is an isolationist, bring everybody home, don't get in the way of Putin or anybody else. And so there is, in that respect, and there are some other Republicans running for president, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, some others, who are also saying what Pence is saying, particularly about Ukraine. So there is an attempt by the sort of Reaganite foreign policy wing of the party, the elite, who still believe that, to revive it. But the thing is, Jason, I don't know how successful they're going to be, because the Republican primary electorate has changed. On entitlements, I did a story about this. You look at the polling, Republican base voters don't want to reform entitlements. They don't want their Medicare and Social Security cut. There's a big streak of isolationism about bringing America home. On abortion, they're conservative, but they're not really where Pence is. So I think that it's going to be very difficult to revive real Reaganite foreign policy, even if the elite want to do it, even if today's candidates want to do it. There's been a realignment at the base level that's going to make that very difficult. And of course, the clearest illustration of what happened in the Trump years was they literally didn't have a platform in 2020. There was a platform, Trump wins, and then the platform is whatever the leader says, which again is sort of textbook authoritarianism.
I mean, could you see a world in which those shifts within the Republican Party and the directions that Trump has taken them would actually be a good thing if you just took Donald Trump out of the equation? I mean, you look at things that muscular foreign policy got us into with Iraq. You look at entitlements and the people's need for those things. Are some of those positions, can you see a Republican Party where those are actually good positions? It's just Donald Trump and his particular brand of politics making those problematic? Or do you think that the old Republican way of doing things, there's some value to that?
There's certainly value in specific critiques, like take the Iraq War, right? Disaster, right? So there's a reason why a lot of Republicans are like, we don't want to do that again. And it's great that they learned that lesson. I was one of the people who supported the Iraq War. It's really obvious. It was a terrible mistake. I did something wrong. Rethink it. I'm glad that Republicans are doing that. But in general, the problem is it's not like the mistakes of the past were learned, and therefore the Republican Party is going to adopt some happy, nice, safe ideology. What is substituted for a lot of those previous views is this sort of pernicious cultural conservatism, which is ethnocentric. It's anti-Muslim. It's anti-immigrant. It's anti-woke. It's anti-trans. So some of the what has surfaced in lieu of Reagan, in lieu of Reaganism, is a much more pernicious, much more harmful in some ways cultural agenda, which it's not a war, but it's a war at home. It's a cultural war, and a lot of people are going to get hurt.
We have a bunch of questions from the audience. I'm just going to start going through them now. David Kranz, class of 1978, writes, "It seems to me that the very interesting phenomenon is how the base of the Republican Party drifted from the type of conservatism that Graham represented, neoconservative foreign policy, pure free market policies, basically Reagan's brand of conservatism, to Trump's awful so-called populism. Despite never having run and spending very little of his own money, Trump completely crushed his established Republican opposition in 2016. Graham was surprisingly candid in saying after Trump's victory that he wanted to remain relevant. Rank opportunism, yes, but pretty clear cut. Would like your thoughts on that."
Yeah, the remaining relevant thing is pretty clear. One of the last things that I saw before I had to file the last version of the article was Graham talking to Saudi TV. It was I think it was Al Arabiya, and he's previously Graham had said, "I'm not going." MBS, Mohammed bin Salman murdered Jamal Khashoggi. I'm not going to have anything to do with this bloody regime. Then the Saudis are like, "Yeah, we'll spend $37 billion on Boeing on getting arms from Boeing, which has got a plant in South Carolina." And suddenly Graham literally says, "Hey, for $37 billion, I'm coming over there." He makes up with MBS, and he says in this interview, I believe that he used the term "fear of missing out." And he's talking about sort of the Saudi Renaissance, as he now puts it, right? But it is a reflection of the way Graham thinks. He does always want to be relevant, and he did say that on a couple of occasions. So so what happens is Trump has replaced the Reaganite view with this Trumpian populism, which I think is corrosive in all the ways I described. And Graham, is to remain relevant, is adopting all of that populism with all of its harms.
Barry Shkolnick from the class of 1980 asks if you hold out any hope that a center-right coalition might reemerge in the Republican Party, either in this current presidential race or many years down the line. I mean, I guess this would be kind of like the bulwark wing of the Republican Party. Is there any hope that wing actually stays in the Republican Party, or are those people just going to have to go to the Democrats?
I don't think they can control the Republican Party as it currently exists. And just to be clear, I think a lot of the worst people in the Republican Party today, and yes, I do think their party is full of some very bad people. I'm going to try not to use the word deplorable, but that a lot of folks truly are. They originally came from the Democratic Party. I'm from Texas, right? And These are the George Wallace people. They were the anti-immigrant, anti-gay, whatever, and they've just moved into the Republican Party and they now dominate it. So the center right, the more liberal-minded people who might be economically conservative but not culturally so conservative, there just aren't enough of them. They are the elite. They are donors. They're just not enough of them to control the party. So I'm much more interested in, and a lot of my colleagues at the Bulwark are interested in, this small portion of the Republican Party that cannot control the Republican Party, at least temporarily align with the Democratic Party. And I'll just put it in my words, Jason, to administer a series of electoral beatings to the Republican Party, just to pound it again and again, cycle after cycle with defeats, so that at least the prospect of never having power until it changes might induce some change on the part of politicians who don't have any principle on their own, people like Kevin McCarthy, but who at least want to have some power to govern and need the votes to do that.
Mm-hmm. This is a sort of related question from William Dorsey. He asks if there was a preconditioning of the Republican Party's perspective on populism and power before Trump came to the scene, referencing the changes they made in the 60s to welcome former Dixiecrats after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The party sort of steadily moved to the right after that. Is this a continuation of that, or is this a rupture?
It's not a straight line. It is a continuation in the way I was just trying to describe. I mean, this is just my version of it, that it's the Wallace vote. It's the Southern strategy. Let's get, this cultural wing, the right wing of the Democratic Party, into the Republican Party. And that worked. And there were a lot of, I think what's happened since then, to the extent that it's a continuation, I guess I would describe it as the sort of Mitt Romney types in the Republican Party, the George H.W. Bush types, the donors in the Republican Party, the elite. They thought they could sort of ride this, they would ride the tiger of this audience. And they had their very subtle, racial messages, sometimes not so subtle, but the whole point of it was for those people were not supposed to actually run the party. The base was not, the right-wing base, the cultural right, was not supposed to run the party. It was supposed to provide votes, provide, small donations or whatever. And it seems that what has happened since the Tea Party, basically, so in roughly the last decade, is that the base just took over, and that this is our party now. And so, yeah, there are now a lot of the elite types looking at this and saying, we can't take it back. We don't have the power to take it back from them. And I think that's correct. So I guess it is true that it's a continuation. It's just that the exact nature of the issues has changed.
William Bellinger asks a question about Newt Gingrich. He thinks that Gingrich was sort of the beginning of the deterioration of cordiality between the political parties, and he's wondering how that connects to the corruption of Lindsey Graham. I mean, and Lindsey Graham, I think even to this day, still has pretty good relations with Democrats in the Senate, at least. He certainly did before Trump and even somewhat into Trump. He was never one to demonize him that much. I mean, I guess that changed during the Kavanaugh hearings, it seemed. But how much of this, how does Graham sort of factor into that kind of, really nasty kind of partisan edge that Gingrich brought to the Hill and brought to Congress in Washington back, in the early 90s?
Well, I'd have to go back and look at the Gingrich era. My recollection of Gingrich was that he was very much about total war, that he was about defeating. He polarized. The Democrats were evil. It was an ideological portrait of the Democratic Party. They are liberals. They are the left. We are the right. We have completely different values from them. We need to defeat them. We need to crush them. So it wasn't really so much anymore about compromising on legislation. It wasn't a practical agenda. And so that certainly has continued, that this is a Manichaean, us or them kind of view, which, we see then in the Tea Party and in the Trump movement. And that has been extremely harmful. That is one of the most corrosive things that has happened because the more paranoid you become about the other side, whether it's true that you actually believe it or whether you're just selling it to the Republican audience that believes it, the more capable you are of rationalizing absolute evil on your own side. You whatever Donald Trump does is okay because we have to defeat the evil left. So I think of that as a little bit of a legacy of Gingrich. And Graham is an interesting case of that because, and I would just caveat, Jason, that to this day, Lindsey Graham does work with Democrats on issues. He'll do a press conference, they'll talk about Ukraine. He'll, on specific issues, he'll work with them. But politically, he crossed the line in 2018 where he'd never campaigned against a colleague, he said. And he said, I'm now going to do that because the other side is so evil. And I would argue to you that it was because of Trump that the Republicans had to take another step in that direction. They needed to rationalize stuff that Trump was doing that was so bad that they needed the portrait of the Democrats to be absolutely black and white and evil. And that's what they did.
Benjamin Weiner has a question about the popularity of politicians who are authoritarian. And he writes, I understand why you wouldn't want to touch the word fascism, but there are parallels to the rise of it as discussed in books like They Thought They Were Free. Do you think it's possible that authoritarianism persists because the base actually wants that?
Oh yes, absolutely. So I would just want to be careful about talking about the base because it's obviously a collection of people with slightly different. There certainly is an authoritarian electorate, and if you look at polls, you will find people who say, we want what America really needs is a strong leader. I mean, there are some very good polling questions that identify voters who have authoritarian tendencies to begin with. So those folks certainly exist. And some of the messages that you hear now from Republicans about needing a strong leader who controls, who will, a classic case. What we're hearing in the 2024 campaign is about the weaponization of the Justice Department, right? About the deep state. The deep state has become kind of a term for the bureaucracy that stands in the way of the people's representative, namely the president, doing pretty much whatever the hell he wants. We elected him to go in and clean them out. And so this isn't explicitly authoritarian, but you can see logically, structurally how it is authoritarian because we're going to get rid of anyone who is in the government whose job is to serve the United States and not the guy who won the election. The guy who won the election has a mandate on this theory, a democratic mandate, perversely, to sweep out everybody in his way. And a lot of voters in the Republican Party are with that, and that is a recipe for absolute authoritarianism.
Tony Holtzman, class of 55, notes that you haven't mentioned campaign financing, both for Graham and Trump, and he asks how important was or is it for both men? And sort of along those lines, I wonder, what do you think about the rise of small dollar campaign donations and these email appeals to get small dollar donors, which on both the left and right have to be pretty aggressive and pretty hysterical? What role do you see that playing in kind of polarization?
A lot, actually. Now, I should say, unlike a lot of my friends on the left, I'm a deep skeptic of campaign finance reform. I think the history of campaign finance reform is very often unintended consequences and sometimes contrary to what was intended. The shift, the Republican Party has shifted from large dollar to small dollar donations. It's part of the shift from the sort of elite, socially liberal, economically conservative audience to a culturally conservative, economically progressive, or economically egalitarian audience. And what you're getting is the sort of these cultural Republicans, these Tea Party types, the George Wallace types, and they are it's been a shocking. I don't remember what the recent number is. You might remember, Jason. The Republican Party depended in some large part on the large donations, even 4 years ago, 6 years ago, and now it's very much tilted towards the small dollar donations. And the problem is that that's reflective of a political base that in turn is constraining what the politicians can say. The politicians are feeding these voters more of this cultural anger because that's what the small dollar donors want. But the other part of your question is really interesting, which is what the role of fundraising in general and those emails you're talking about, which is very much on point because a lot of what you see on TV, when you see Republicans talking, they're not even saying what they believe. They're saying what they think will raise money. And sometimes they're mentioning their website out loud, right? They're like, go to tedcruz.com or whatever it is and give me money. So the fundraising appeal is driving all the political messaging and is driving the nature of the party itself.
Well, I think you have that moment in your book where Graham is on Hannity before the 20 election talking about, you need to donate to my campaign. They're coming after me just because I support President Trump. I mean, it seems like some of his campaign finance self-interest was wrapped up in his own kind of, stance vis-a-vis Trump, not just with voters, but the money he needed to actually compete.
Absolutely. And there was a correlation. The angrier he got, the more his voice would go up, right? As he's getting more and more passionate and inflammatory in what he's saying, as he is doing these interviews leading up the last couple of months before the 2020 election, in which he's basically trolling for donations on Fox News.
James Becker asks, what do you think about the notion that the Republican Party is becoming more authoritarian independently of Trump as a matter of self-preservation? It has been shrinking and continues to shrink. The result, a minority party fighting to maintain power, which inevitably calls for voter suppression, radical gerrymandering to maintain white power in increasingly diverse jurisdictions, et cetera. I mean, is this, and you see this in certain states, I think. I live in North Carolina, and some of the ways in which Republicans here, even pre-Trump, sort of did things to state government in such a way that would increase their power because they saw that without that they were going to be out of power. I mean, is there something to that, or is Trump just part of a larger story, or is Trump kind of an accelerant?
So the structural argument is really interesting. Here's my answer to it about, gerrymandering, becoming a minority party and trying to, rig things so that even as a minority party, they can still control. And it's true, the Electoral College and gerrymandering and those, they play a role at the margins, and they could account for a lot of that. But I would say to anyone who believes that the Republican Party is maintaining itself through minority rule and through these games, you are an optimist. I know that sounds bizarre, but you are an optimist if you think that most Americans think like us, and therefore, if we could just have majority rule, we would have a sane government. That is not true, unfortunately. I would just point out that in the midterm elections, I believe congressional House Republicans got 54% of the popular vote. They have a majority. This cultural conservatism, I mean, Swarthmorians are just not at all representative of America. We represent a lot of America, but not a majority. Cultural conservatism is extremely popular, extremely common. And one of the things that a lot of white liberals have got to wrap their heads around is there's not some magic about being non-white that's going to, protect people from falling into this authoritarianism. A lot of what's happened to the Democratic Party in the last few years is a surprising number of Black and brown Americans have been voting Republican, and some of them voted for Trump. And there's this, mystery, like, why is this happening? These cultural messages are dangerously powerful, and we have to figure out how to grapple with that. We can't just tell ourselves that if we could clean up the system and get rid of gerrymandering and the Electoral College, we would have the government we want.
Mark Salzberg, class of 87, asks, how important was the Kavanaugh hearing to Graham's evolution, both substantively as well as behaviorally? And relatedly, Stephen Gessner asks, what do you see as the role of the Supreme Court in the movement towards authoritarianism?
The Kavanaugh hearing, first of all, was absolutely central. I did not intend to write about it when I started out. I mean, it was a thing that happened. I just thought, what does this have to do with authoritarianism? But it became really clear that in Graham's case, that was the trigger that he used to just become a zealot for Trump. Graham had, at the Kavanaugh hearing in in 2018, the September of 2018, he just explodes at the hearing. Like, this is about Christine Blasey Ford, and the Democrats are trying to sandbag you, Judge Kavanaugh. And you can watch the video, and everyone's watching him. The Republican colleagues are watching him too. Everyone's baffled. Like, really? You're getting so pissed off about this? But that's the juncture at which Graham commits himself to Trump. It's like he goes through this process of, they're so awful that I need to,
I hope you never get power, he says, right?
Yeah. I hope you never get. And you can hear it in his voice. He's so angry, and then he gets all this tongue bath, this love from all the Trumpers who didn't love him before. And so that's a huge transition for him. And you can see how then in the spring of 2019, he just descends into this polarized worldview I was talking about, where he can rationalize anything Trump does. Wait, what was the larger problem? Oh, the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and then
The
what? Yeah,
Supreme
what
Court
was?
in general. So I'm a squish about the Supreme Court. I believe that one of the elements of the Republican or of the conservative movement that has least flipped over to Trumpism is the judicial conservatives. It is the Federalist Society. And right now, obviously, a lot of people are pissed off about Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito and the billionaires and all that. But it is absolutely true that judges appointed by Donald Trump rejected his lies about the 2020 election, right? They did not vote for him. The Supreme Court let him down. The Supreme Court recently has made some fairly moderate rulings about the Voting Rights Act. So far, I think that the Supreme Court has held in the sense that it has followed rules and it has followed precedents. And to the extent that it has ruled in ways liberals don't like, it has been largely about limiting its own intrusion, limiting the role of courts in politics rather than imposing a right-wing view. And as long as that holds, I think the Supreme Court is not the problem. The problem is much more actually in the electorate and the political process.
I have to follow up then, just since you wrote a book about it. What about abortion? In terms of, the Supreme Court limiting its rulings and the like. I mean, I'm not saying Donald Trump was necessarily intent on overturning Roe v. Wade, but it was something that he certainly campaigned on, and you could make the argument that he won in 2016 in part because he activated Republican voters on that issue. And certainly the Alito Thomas stuff does suggest a certain flouting of norms and the like. I guess you're saying that the court wouldn't overturn an election on Trump's behalf, but what about intervening in and interfering in ways in our politics that are maybe more anti-democratic, small d, than they were before? That this is a fairly radical court in that respect, and that's not necessarily authoritarianism, but I mean, do you see some connection there at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's some bit of a connection. I wouldn't call it about abortion. I mean, let me take the example of abortion and guns. Okay, on abortion, the Supreme Court in Dobbs ruled that the court's going to step out of the issue and let the political process resolve it, right? And you can disagree with that, but that's not imposing an anti-abortion policy, right? You can choose the anti-abortion policy if you want, and I understand the arguments why it is a constitutional right, but that's not imposing it. Guns is a different story. On guns, the Supreme Court has ruled, New York State can't limit fairly moderate gun restrictions. And that is, and I understand there's a text of it in the Second Amendment, but that is an interpretation of the clause about the militia and stuff that imposes at the level of constitutional rights, so that the voters of New York can't overturn that. They'd have to change the composition of the Supreme Court. So I think the anti-democratic, there are cases of the court ruling in anti-democratic ways, but they're not about abortion. They're about guns and perhaps some other issues.
Roger Smith asks about sort of the centrality of political violence in all of this, and whether there's an appeal and momentum of the authoritarian style that, the encouragement of violence is actually something that people like. And if that's the case, how likely is this encouragement of political violence going to persist? I mean, is it a feature or is it a bug of Trump and authoritarianism?
So if we look at polling, violence per se does not sell. There's this very small audience for violence, and Americans are still generally repelled by violence. They don't want to be like countries where political violence is commonplace. To this day, the violence of January 6th is generally renounced, even by people who defend, those who defend the January 6th participants, the convicts, are generally argue that, these are people who didn't do violence. So we still have that norm. So I don't think that the violence per se is a selling point. It's not broad enough. The downside is much greater for a politician who would promote the violence. What's more corrupt, what worries me more is the way that Lindsey Graham handled it, and I think other Republicans may handle it, which is to broker the violence in this perverse way where, I'm against the violence. I'm against, the insurrection, and I'm against people, committing violence over Trump being indicted or whatever. But, we mustn't indict the president because there will be violence if we do it. Lindsey Graham literally said that they should stop the second impeachment of Trump. Because the impeachment itself was going to cause more violence. When a politician says that, he is basically imposing himself as a broker. So he's using the violence. He's using the threat of violence. These other people are committing, mind you, I don't support it, but he's using that to get a political objective. And that is much more dangerous because that's something that he can sort of sneakily impose.
I don't think this is what Robert Oppenstein is doing, class of 82, but he asks, assuming a Trump conviction, is a Biden pardon our best chance at diffusing the extreme partisanship that we have?
So I hate the pardon power to begin with. I mean, when I was writing this story, I'm looking at Trump's pardons were so corrupt. Just a couple of days ago, Mike Pence's former chief of staff was on Fox News, and he actually talked about how corrupt the pardons were. I mean, Trump pardoned people who, lied and cheated to cover up for Trump. He pardoned people who had committed all kinds of crimes. Trump isn't the first one to do it. He's just the most egregious. The whole idea of pardons, the whole idea of a president unilaterally deciding this sort of thing, I almost think we need a constitutional amendment to get rid of it. I mean, I hate all the pardons. If there's going to be a pardon process, there needs to be checks and balances. Checks and balances are why this country still exists. The idea of one person having that power is extremely dangerous. So I would be against Joe Biden or anyone else unilaterally pardoning Trump. Also, I'm just kind of a hardcore law and order guy, and Donald Trump broke the law. And people who did what Donald Trump has done, withholding classified documents, and he just deliberately obstructed the FBI from getting them. He was under subpoena. I mean, people go to jail for that shit. And he absolutely, if we're going to uphold the rule of law, I don't really care that he is the former president. He should go to jail because we do need equal justice in this country. And the Republicans claim that they're against unequal justice, but that's what they're asking for when they say that because he's a former president, he should be treated differently.
You had mentioned earlier that the hope of kind of the center right folks and the bulwark folks is that Republicans will lose enough elections. They'll lose so many elections at a certain point they'll come to their senses. I mean, do you see any sort of upside to a conviction of Trump furthering that process, speeding up that process, or would a conviction of Trump, just from a pure matter of politics, putting aside a pardon, does that further kind of entrench him and entrench his supporters within the Republican Party? I mean, given the idea that, I think you mentioned this at the end of your book, you have these sort of 20 takeaways, sort of the things you took away. And, there was one of them, I'm trying to find it now, but just this idea that any kind of criticism or,
Right.
finding a fault becomes sort of more evidence that you're being persecuted. Given that dynamic, like, how do you see this Trump case playing out? I mean, it's obviously helped him short term, it seems, within the Republican primary. Like his indictment seems to have increased his poll numbers, at least until a couple of days ago. Could you see that, his conviction in a certain way, like him becoming this martyr, actually making it harder to get rid of this strain within the GOP and within our politics?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. I would separate it into two parts, though. The case itself, we've had the indictment come out, and the indictment presented evidence, and they have documentation, they have eyewitness testimony, they have audio tapes and so forth. To the extent that it details what Trump did, that makes Trump look really bad, because what Trump did was really bad. And to the extent that that information about what he did gets out, that hurts Donald Trump. But the conviction is a different question, right? Sending the guy to jail, if Donald Trump goes to jail, that absolutely helps. It galvanizes the Republican Party behind him. It fuels this idea, wait, you're sending a former president to jail. This is being done by the incumbent administration. It's not. It's being done by, there's a special counsel, there's a jury, there's all that. But that does galvanize. And I think what we have to do as people who believe in the rule of law is say, yeah, that's too bad. It's not good. It's not good politically. It's going to help the other side galvanize behind Trump. It could result in a Trump nomination, perversely. But we're going to have to set that aside and just follow the rule of law, because that's what the law and the facts show in this case, and that's what the jury decided. So I would do it despite the political consequences.
This last question is from David Harrison, and he notes that Biden would seem to welcome a 2024 presidential election premised on the opposition between authoritarianism and democracy. Authoritarianism being Trump, Biden being democracy. That does seem to be the calculus that the White House is making. They want to run against Donald Trump. How how dangerous is that? I mean, given the hyper polarization of the time, the hyper partisanship. I mean, do you think the Biden administration, Biden himself, is wrong that he wants Donald Trump to be his opponent? Is the risk too great for that? I mean, would you personally breathe a sigh of relief if Ron DeSantis was the Republican nominee and he were then to defeat Biden? Would that be a better outcome in some ways than just the mere possibility of Trump getting back in office? And I think we'll end on that question.
Sure, sure. And my answer to you is, in 2016, I wanted Donald Trump to be the nominee because I thought he'd be easy to beat. So if I'm going to, one of my rules in life, if I'm going to make a mistake, it better be a different mistake from the mistake I made last time. So I'm not going to do that again. And there are reasons to believe that he couldn't get reelected again because people have seen how awful he is in a way that wasn't as clear before. But I'm not going to take that chance. So Jason, not only would I want DeSantis to win, if it gets to the Maryland primary and I am allowed to cross over, because I used to be an independent voter here, and if I can re-register, because Joe Biden's got the Democratic nomination, if I can re-register, and if Donald Trump is up against pretty much anyone over there, let's take DeSantis as an example, I would switch over to the Republican Party to vote for DeSantis because Donald Trump is an existential threat to the continuation of this country as a democracy. And we have two shots to get rid of him, not one. The one in the general election. But if we can take him out in the primary, by take him out, I mean legally, politically, we should do that. We should do that. And as bad as Ron DeSantis is in all the ways he is bad, he has not literally tried to overthrow the government of the United States. He has not done that. He has not called for literally suspending the Constitution.
A very low bar here.
Very low bar. So I am for minimizing the risk. And the risk is Trump. And if we end up with 4 years of, or even 8 years of DeSantis, that's going to suck, but America will go on, I believe. And that's not the case if Trump wins.
Okay. All right. Will, thank you so much. This was fantastic. It was really, really great to have you talk about this. Thank you everybody for tuning in. If you do want to see this later, you can see it on the website. And we will resume the SWAT talks, I think in September. We're going to take the summer off, but we'll be back in the fall. Will, thank you again. Thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in, and have a great summer. See ya.